Shalom, Reverend John Ferret, and welcome to Lesson 47 of the Torah Bible Study series, The Gospel According to Moses, according to the book of Exodus. We finally reached Exodus chapter 20, and we're going to be focusing in on the first 17 verses of Exodus chapter 20, which is really the 17 verses of the Ten Commandments. This is such an awesome time that we have come to, this giving of the Ten Commandments. It is just amazing. And so for us, we're going to be spending multiple sessions of lesson 47. Some will be video, some may be just audio, but going through all 17 verses of chapter 20, like I said, all related to the Ten Commandments. And once again, we want to take a look at four aspects of this entire series, both here in the book of Exodus and also in the book of Genesis. And number one, and that is, how do the Hebrews who are coming out of Egypt, they're the first audience for the Torah, the first audience for the first 5 books of the Bible. They're coming out of Egypt. How did they understand this? How did they understand the Ten Commandments, the covenant of God? Second of all, Jesus says in John 5:39 that scripture testifies of him. He says that between 24 to 30 AD, and all they had was the Old Testament, the Hebrew scriptures at that time. And so we ask ourselves, how did that audience then hear these words and understand the concept of the Ten Commandments? And then the third aspect is Jesus' disciples. They changed the world with the Old Testament. They did not have the New Testament. The gospel was in the Hebrew scriptures. The gospel was in the Torah. How? And then obviously for us today, how does that come to us today, and how do we understand it? Now, I know that there are amazing Bible studies on the Ten Commandments out there. Amazing resources to study the Ten Commandments. And they're in book form, they're in video form, they're probably recorded sessions from some Christian or Jewish scholar, and you can get them on CD or DVD, printed versions of articles and papers and so on. And Light of Menorah is not trying to reteach the Ten Commandments. We're not trying to do that whatsoever. But when we take the Bible and put it back into its historical context, what we find is there are things that enhance our understanding of the Ten Commandments. They enrich our understanding. And all of a sudden, you might agree with me that this event at the mountain of God, Mount Sinai, is just awesome. Really awesome. As we put the Bible back into its historical context. So with this in mind, let's begin. As we saw in lesson 46, and that was in 2 parts, we were studying Exodus chapter 19. They arrived at Sinai, and they are about to receive the Ten Commandments. And one of the things is, it's more than a bunch of do's and don'ts, a bunch of laws that we have to keep. They are about to enter a covenant. We remember Michelangelo's famous painting of the creation, where God's hand is reaching out to Adam. It's like reaching out to us. To me, it speaks of God's desire for relationship. I think this is verified again and again. We take a look at Exodus 29, verses 45 through 46, and we read in there that God is saying, I want to dwell among my people. And in other places in Exodus, and we'll come to that as we continue on with this series, that God actually says to Moses, build me a tent. Translated into Greek as tabernacle, but all it means is tent. Build me a tent, that I may dwell among my people. Again, we see this in John chapter 1, verse 14, very famous verse. And the word became flesh and dwelt among us. However, The Greek word there, skino, basically means to camp out in a tent or a tabernacle. And here is Jesus who's coming out to camp out in a tabernacle, in his tent. And all of a sudden, John chapter 1, that gospel is all already connected back to Sinai, back to that first new covenant at the mountain of God. Take a look at John chapter 14, verse 20. Talk about relationship. Jesus says that in that day, and this is at his Last Supper, this is the night before he died. He says, and in that day you will know that I'm in the Father, and you in me, and I in you. He came to dwell with us and to be in us. So this is about God more than dwelling with us, more than dwelling in us, as we see in the New Testament. It's God dwelling with us and in us, and we are in a covenant relationship with him. That's the additional piece. And this is a big deal, as we're going to see now and in subsequent lessons. So, as we study the new covenant at the mountain of God at Sinai, who were led by the Israelites, who were led by their leader, Moses, chosen by God. You might say Moses was the shepherd of Israel. When we hear all these words that I just said, they say, wait a minute, for Christians, this reminds us of a new covenant given at the mountain of God at Jerusalem. Yes, the mountain of God had moved. We'll take a look at those verses in just a little bit. A new covenant at the mountain of God in Jerusalem. And who's our leader? Who's the one that we follow? Who's our good shepherd? Messiah Jesus. Now we're going to see that the second new covenant, that's the new covenant that we Christians are so familiar with, does not replace, I repeat, does not replace the Sinai covenant, the new covenant at the mountain of God at Sinai. But the second new covenant is a necessary aspect of God's plan of redemption. So let's begin our focus on Exodus 20, verses 1 through 17. Our focus will be on the Ten Commandments. And there are 5 different aspects I would like to take a look at in here in this first session as we're introducing the Ten Commandments. So the first of the 5 aspects I'd like to deal with is the fact that when we're dealing with the original Hebrew, there is no statement of 10 commandments whatsoever. Just as an example, you go to the New American Standard Bible, that translation, and you take a look at Exodus 34:28, and you see the words 10 commandments. It says the tablets, the words of the covenant, that's important. The words of the covenant are the 10 commandments. You can see it in Hebrew from the Masoretic text, and you can see the Hebrew words there in the middle of the screen in yellow, and those are the Hebrew words that are translated all the way to the English as 10 commandments. And the Hebrew is Aseret HaDevareem. Aseret HaDevareem. Now, there are only 3 verses in the Bible where the word 10 commandments actually appears. Now, we're going to look at 4 popular translations. King James on the left, next is New American Standard, then the ESV, and then the standard translation in Judaism, the JPS translation, the Jewish Publication Society translation of the Bible. They call it the Tanakh, and T stands for Torah, N stands for Nevi'im, and the Het, the K, is Ketuvim, means the writings. So you've got the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, the Nevi'im, the prophets, and then you've got the rest of the books like Psalms and Proverbs and so on, the Ketuvim, and that is the acronym Tanakh, which is basically means the Old Testament or the Hebrew Scriptures. Now, when we look at this, you can see, starting on the left and working our way to the right, the English translations of the King James, the ESV, and the New American Standard all say 10 commandments. However, when we get to the translation of the Bible that the Jewish people use in Judaism today, one of their standard translations, the JPS, it says 10 words. And that's a direct translation right from the Hebrew. The other verse, or the second verse, is Deuteronomy 4:13. We see the same thing, King James, and then the New American Standard, and then the ESV, all the way working across is the 10 Commandments. However, the JPS in Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 13, again says the 10 words. And again, we see this in the last of the three verses, Deuteronomy 10:4, and we see the same thing. The common, very popular translations in English for Christians, the 10 Commandments is used rather than the 10 words. So in the Hebrew, as I mentioned before, it's Aseret, HaDevareem, the 10 words, or the 10 statements, or the 10 proclamations. The Hebrew word for commandment is mitzvah. Plural is mitzvahot, commandments. And it's not even used here in the Hebrew. So what we have, you guys, is this. Starting with the Geneva Bible, and then the Bishop's Bible, and then finally the King James Bible, which was published in 1611, but those other two Bibles came before. Those were the English Bibles, the earliest translations. They mistranslated the Hebrew. And they said 10 commandments, and it should be 10 statements, 10 words, 10 proclamations of God. It's not even in the Septuagint. The Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Old Testament directly from the Hebrew. And what do we find in the Septuagint? But decalogue. And decalogue means the 10 words or the 10 statements. That's where we get the English word decalogue, coming from the Greek of 10 words. Now we're going to study Aseret, mitzvot, the 10 commandments, but we're going to study them in their textual context. We will study them among the statements God made, Aseret, HaDevareem, the 10 statements, because we're going to see within the statements are the commandments. And so indeed, here's the commandments amidst of all the words that God had spoken. What we're looking at here is Exodus chapter 20, verses 1 through 17. And I've underlined the 10 commandments of the Jewish people in Judaism. And I just want you to know, as you're looking at those words that are underlined, they are amidst all the rest of the words that God had stated. There's a lot. If you just talk about 10 commandments, there's a lot more here than meets the eye of 10 commandments. Here's the Catholic version. And we have the first commandment there in orange, the second one in green, the third in pink, the fourth in yellow, and the final one, you shall not murder, is in purple. And then the next 5 in orange, green, pink, yellow, and purple. Those are the 10 for the Catholics. And here are the 10 for the Protestants. And again, you can find this on the internet anywhere. This is probably in Bible studies that you've taken before. You probably have seen this before. But here's the point that I want to make. When we look again at Exodus chapter 20, verses 1 through 17, and I'm looking again at the New American Standard, we can see the Jewish 10 commandments underlined in red within the total, all the statements made by God. So again, what we have, we want to study the 10 commandments in their textual context. And so therefore, we might even ask, are there 10 commandments? Now, I fully understand how the Jewish people, the Catholics, and we Protestants came up with the list of 10. I can see that. Now, when I take a look at the JPS Torah commentary and done by the brilliant Jewish scholar Nahum Sarna, he addresses this and goes into a little bit more background regarding the idea of what is the number of commandments. So quoting from the JPS Torah commentary from Nahum Sarna, the popular English title, the 10 Commandments, English title, is derived from the traditional, although inaccurate, English rendering of the Hebrew phrase Aseret HaDevareem that appears in Exodus 24:28, Deuteronomy 4:13, and Deuteronomy 10:4. We just talked about that. In fact, the term commandment, mitzvah, or mitzvah plural, is not employed in the present context. The Hebrew means, rather, 10 words, 10 statements, 10 proclamations, which the Jews of ancient Alexandria in Egypt translated literally into the Greek as decalogue, 10 words. This gives rise to the more accurate English alternative, decalogue. In fact, traditional exegesis derived 13, not 10 commandments from the decalogue. And this was found in a 13th century Jewish book called Sefer HaHanuk, or Hinuk. So our question then is, how many commandments are there? And this is another aspect that we need to take a look at. So the third aspect I want to take a look at is, are there 10, 12, or 16? And just as an example, again, when we go to Exodus 20, verses starting with verse 2 through 17, we know what a commandment is. A commandment is, it's a command. You do this. You better do this. So we could actually look at this, and we find that you shall have no other gods before me. There's a command. Another command is, you shall not make for yourself an idol or any likeness of what is in heaven, above, or on earth beneath, etc. Here's another one. You shall not worship them or serve them. A direct command. Here's another command. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. Another command. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Now this gets interesting. In 6 days you shall work. God is commanding you to work on 6 days. And there's one day called a Sabbath, and that's the day you keep it holy. You shall not do any work. You or your son or your daughter, your entire family, even your animals. So now you have a command. It's not just about you on the Sabbath not doing any work, but it's you, your daughter, your entire family, and even your animals. Honor your father and your mother. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. Here's another command. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or you shall not covet anything of your neighbor's. That's 15. So how many commandments are there? 10, 14, or 15? This is just an interesting look at two things. One, the actual Hebrew talks about Aseret HaDevareem, 10 statements that God makes. We can see that the church itself, starting with the Geneva Bible back in about 1570 something or at that time, that the Geneva Bible was the first English Bible that came out and mistranslated the Hebrew and said 10 commandments. And that's come down to us today. Now, I have no problem whether somebody says 10 statements or somebody says whether 10 commandments. That's really not the issue. What we really want to take a look at is, if you remember that picture, we saw the Jewish 10 commandments underlined in red, and there were a lot more words there. So again, what we want to do is take the 10 commandments, put them back in their textual context, and to see what else there is in God's 10 special statements of his covenant, called the 10 statements that we call the 10 commandments.